Hey Garth,
Hey Joe, how's it going?
good. How are you?
I am not bad.
Special thanks to the Baltimore Comic Con for hosting us virtually here. We wish we could be there in person. I guess that would be this weekend,
Yeah,
but
I miss that. That's always a good time. It
it
really,
is. I
yeah.
think the most intoxicated I've ever been has been at that show in the after hours. Just think about the escalator.
Oh God, yeah, yeah. Well, those files remain sealed.
Exactly. Um, so I put together some questions. I reached out to your number one fan and my Facebook friend, Rob Gibson.
Oh, Rob,
And he
right.
put together some questions, and then we put out a call on social media, the dreaded and evil social media, for some questions. I filtered through some of those, and we'll do a little lightning round at the end. And we'll start by talking about Dear Becky,
Right.
which I think is your, not just for us, but I think is your most current piece of writing. I know you had a thing in a DC special a couple weeks ago,
Yeah.
um, but obviously Dear Becky was written pre-COVID. Um,
Most of it was. I think I got as far as five,
yeah,
and then there was a break. Not much of a break actually, and then I finished it off.
so I guess the question is the next piece of writing that you do for whomever it is stuff from this last year going to make its way into that, or are you steering clear of what
Um,
2020 has been?
At the moment, I'm mostly writing World War II material, so
Right.
obviously, pandemic talk isn't going to make much of an appearance in that. Yeah, there's. I was talking about this with a friend recently. That there is this terrible need people have to respond, to get something into print instantly, to discuss whatever the issue of the moment is. Now, I quite naturally tend to shy away from that. I tend to
Right.
sort of wait and see, figure out how I feel about things, how they're regarded historically. Um, Generally, instant responses tend to be, not always, but tend to be perhaps a little poorly thought out.
Exactly. And also,
Yeah, I'm talking here about writing
yeah,
fiction. I'm not talking about social media
right.
response or commentary or anything like that. I'm talking about people writing fiction. I tend, as I say, I tend to sort of hold off and see what the long term repercussions are before I rush anything out, rather
Well,
than rush anything out.
sure, sure. But in Dear Becky, I remember when we were talking about Dear Becky was going to contain some of your thoughts about the culture as a whole in terms of
Right,
how Huey was dealing with things. Now
right.
that obviously had germinated and had time to percolate and had time to be given full form by the time you got around to writing it. So that kind of goes to what you're
Sure.
speaking of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are comments involving the pandemic, involving the coronavirus, but in the first issue, I think, and later on, but particularly in the first issue, it's almost abstract. It's a distant threat. It's presumably, as it was, something that's happening in a faraway land that hasn't affected anybody else at that point. And so Huey and his pal Bobby just don't take it very seriously.
Right.
Because by the end of the story, as it became for all of us, it's an absolute reality. It's unavoidable.
Yeah. And when you have Huey, speaking of what I guess the shorthand is woke culture,
Right.
is there anything that you would expand upon now that you were writing about then, or do you think that the culture is pretty much still kind of stuck in that same place that you were speaking of in those early issues?
Mm-hmm. I would say so. Obviously, the last 6 months have seen an acceleration of, gosh, just about everything that was happening back then. I mean, as we head into this election from hell, that's obviously going to increase. Huey's own reaction to it, I think, is he's very confident about how he feels. He has no doubt about where he stands, and yet I would point out that he begins and ends that first issue curled up in a ball with his pants around his ankles on the floor of his bathroom.
Our
So,
hero.
yeah, our hero, exactly. Um, so he'll show these cancel culture people where they stand. But I think that was something about that was something I used to see in Huey back in the original series, is that He enjoyed pontificating. He enjoyed getting on a soapbox and sounding off. But real events in the book, and particularly the actions of, obviously, someone like Butcher, could quite easily sweep his legs out from under him.
Yeah.
You know, he would find himself nowhere near as certain of himself as he was. As to what he actually says about woke culture, some of it I agree with. Some of it I think he goes a bit too far. But it's very much, I think, the position of a guy who's 100% certain of himself and who just doesn't really engage with a lot of this stuff on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people tend to think, oh, the writer, what he's saying is what the writer believes. And that is
Right.
very rarely the case. I mean, some of the things you believe, not just on this issue, but
exactly,
you're writing fiction, you're.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I've noticed that just recently, people seem to think that not only are the words the author puts in the hero's mouth a true statement of how the writer feels, but almost everything that ends up in the story must somehow be a true reflection of how the writer feels. Things that villains say, things that I would have thought quite obvious monsters and complete bastards say, are taken very, very seriously by some people, as if by putting them in print, you're somehow condoning them. It seems to me there are people out there perhaps losing their grip on how to read and consider fiction.
Yeah, there's an emptiness out there in a lot of people that gets filled by whatever's available. It used to be filled by religion, but now it's filled by whatever's on hand at the moment. And I don't know that either one is good, but that's a discussion for another day. Rob,
there's real hope for the future.
Yeah. Rob asks a very insightful question. I'm going to read it here so I don't butcher it. Now, it breaks off into 3 questions at the end, so I'll stop before I get to the end of each one. It's talking about Becky, obviously the titular character here in Dear Becky. Becky could not be more polar opposite of Butcher. A competent social worker seems like an unlikely but ultimately phenomenal counterbalance to a traumatized trigger puller. She shines as hope in a hopeless world. Any husband whose wife has changed life for the better can relate. What does Becky represent to you? That's part 1.
Interesting that he says she's his polar opposite. I wouldn't say that was completely true. I think they do share a sense of humor, so long as Butcher keeps the brakes on his to an extent, because he can go to some fairly dark places. You are seeing Butcher, when he's with Becky, at his absolute best. There's no question that were you to compare Becky with the man he later became, that Rob would be absolutely right, and they would be on different planets, never mind polar opposites. To me, I suppose Becky represents Butcher's shot, his one chance, his hope, the tiny window within which he could have been a good man.
Yeah.
That said, I don't want Becky. I never wanted Becky just to represent some facet of the lead character of Butcher. I wanted her to be a character in and of herself. I always thought that she shone through pretty strongly in the 2 episodes of the original series that she appears in. Really, she doesn't get much screen time, page time, but she does make an impression, and I think she had to, given how important she was in Butcher's life and what she had inspired him to go on to do, without her meaning to do that. But that was always an itch I felt the need to scratch, to go back and give Becky a fair shake.
Give her due, I think is what you had said.
Give her some time in the limelight.
Yeah. He goes on to say how gratifying, I think you kind of explained this, but this is an interesting point he makes here. How gratifying it is to return to a character whose positivity stands out throughout your entire body of work. Wow. You might not be wrong there in terms of her positivity. Although
We should
There's some
maybe
naive positivity in some of your characters that she is not naive, but
yeah, she's not naive. She knows who Butcher is. She doesn't know the very depths that he sank to. I mean, she's made it clear she doesn't want to hear war stories, but she wants to make sure that any leftover emotion, any problems resulting from his wartime service and also from his abusive upbringing by his father don't come back on him in later life. She is unquestionably a very decent, good-hearted person. There's a sequence, let me see, I think issue 6 is about to come out.
Yes, that's one we just wrapped.
Yeah. There's a sequence in issue 6 I was quite pleased with where we see Butcher actually making fun of Becky for how good a person she is,
right,
and her defense of herself, which doesn't get very far because she has to admit that yes, she is a pretty decent spud. But I hope that it's done really in the tradition of the character where she isn't supposed to come across as, she isn't even supposed to be some paragon of virtue. She's just a very ordinary person who does what she can, which I suppose is what her decency springs from.
Right. Rob also asked, I think you covered pretty much his questions about Becky, but he asked an interesting one that I hadn't thought about until I read his question here, because we don't see an appearance from the legend in Dear Becky, and he asked if there was anything from the last 8 years since the original series concluded in the new series that you'd use the legend to break down for the masses, personal or industry-wide lessons observed. I'm not sure the legend's necessarily a teacher, but he does drop truth, so...
Yeah. I did think about using the legend this time around, and he would have fit it in there, but really, ultimately, there were other things I wanted to write about, and so long as I'm focusing on Butcher and Becky and Huey and Annie, that means the other characters are going to have to take a bit of a back seat. If you look at Frenchie, Mallory, the female, and MM, they are very definitely in there. But it's not really their story this time around. Their stories have been told, and you're not, I think, really finding out anything particularly new about them. You might see that Frenchie was in those days as devoted to the female as he would later become. He was almost her spokesman. He was translating for her in the mortal world. Mallory, you see his growing disaffection with Butcher, and yet he still sees the man as incredibly necessary. With MM, and I suppose Frenchie, you see their reluctance, perhaps, to break with the discipline of the quasi-military unit that the boys represents. They don't want to go against Mallory in the way that Butcher does in quite debonair fashion.
Right.
I've gone slightly off topic here, but the point is, many of the old faces from the past were going to make an appearance without necessarily finding out too much more about them, or in the case of the legend, not really make an appearance at all. And as for commentary on the comic book industry, and that was always good fun with the legend, it
seems like a lifetime ago, the things that he was talking about then. He's missed several earth-shaking incidents.
Yeah, of course. I mean, apart from anything else, given that the story is set in that section of the story is set in 1999,
right.
The legend couldn't really be talking about developments between 2012 and 2020, although there would have been a way to get them in there.
Yeah, of course.
Butcher certainly makes some comments on modern phraseology and so on. Yes, it probably would have been good fun. I will say though that it's possible that my own interest in the industry has waned a bit. Now that doesn't mean my interest in comics has waned. I enjoy them as a storytelling medium as much as I ever did. But the ins and outs of the industry, that tendency people go for to regard the comic industry as a kind of spectator sport.
Yeah.
My interest in that, never particularly strong, has and continues to wane. really. And that, by a very long and roundabout route, is why the legend had no part in the story.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of aspects of the business that become part of the public discourse, which really shouldn't be, you know, and the nature of information being open to everyone, obviously that's a great thing, but in some cases, you know, the emperor has no clothes, and it's not it's not good for the business as a whole for everything to be on the out.
people being people, which you can find in any industry.
Exactly.
You know, how interesting and useful that is. I don't know if that's your thing. Sure. Good luck. But, you know, I mean, one question I suppose you could ask is, has this scrutiny made things better? I mean, on the one hand, you could say yes, it has, because a good deal of wrongdoing has been uncovered and sort of punished. But has it made comics better, or more and better comics being made as a result? I don't know. Perhaps that's the wrong way of looking at it. Perhaps
no, I know what you mean, though.
Scrutiny of the industry is just a massive distraction to comics as a storytelling medium.
Yeah, I think the medium has been consistent and hasn't suffered either way. And in a lot of ways, it's gotten better. The medium has gotten a lot better. You know, production values have increased. Access to different types of stories has increased. The ability to do it yourself has increased. And I don't think any of that's changed because of shenanigans. But
yeah, I don't think any of those improvements have really come about because of the weird spotlight that's been shown on the business.
Right. So when I was thinking about us doing this, I was thinking about the signings that I've attended and the misconception that a lot of people have that you still live in a far off land. And to some people you live in New York. And I was wondering, have you ever given thought, and maybe the answer is very quick, but have you ever given thought to how your career, if at all, would have changed had you not moved to the US? Do you see that I mean, obviously the US informs a lot of your storytelling, but is there, would there have been any real change in your career, do you think? You're still in the UK?
If you keep it only to my career, I'm not sure. I mean, socially, in terms of friendships and so on, it would have been very different.
Right.
My career, I'm not sure. It would have made a couple of visits I've made to the West Coast to talk about film and TV a little bit harder, but perhaps even that is somewhere where I would have found a way, and I would have made the effort necessary. I'm not really sure. I know my life would have been vastly different. I mean, I'm enormously happy living where I live. But career-wise, I suppose you could argue that I would have had different experiences in life and therefore would have written different things. But I'm not sure that it would have really affected my career as such.
And then Rob was curious, and I'll put some words in his mouth here, because he was speaking about your citizenship, your U.S. citizenship, and I'm just wondering if you're feeling the weight of that, particularly here in the year 2020. There's no going back.
Right. I mean, you don't just run away, Well, let's say I'm down to my last inch of idealism. put it that way. But I think a lot of people are.
Yeah.
The trouble is that, I mean, for anyone who's been keeping an eye on things, the UK and England in particular, I lived in London before I moved to the US, is almost as big a shit show as parts of the US have managed to get. Certainly, there isn't the kind of hellish disruption and antagonism caused by the election, although they do have that because Brexit has made an unholy mess of things too.
Yeah.
So not that I'm thinking about doing a runner back to the UK, but if I was, it's not looking that good.
And might even be worse to some extent.
Yeah.
It being an island and all, I mean, at least here there's space,
Right. I mean, if I'm going to live on an island, I think I'll make it Manhattan.
Right, exactly. So shifting gears a little bit, I mentioned that you did, and I actually just read it. I think it was out last week. It was the thing in the DC.
Oh yeah, right.
So any other dipping into the mainstream at Marvel or DC in the near future?
Let me think. I mean, I'd always be up for doing funny little things like that. That one came about because Marie Javins, who's an old pal, just asked me if I'd have an 8-10 page thing for this special.
Right.
And I thought it would be good fun. I like revisiting the Noonan's crew. I like working with PJ Holden, who I think got a real kick out of drawing all those characters. Beyond that, there is a Punisher story that has yet to be drawn. A 6-parter I've mentioned a couple of times. Of course, the disruption of the last 6 months has thrown everything off. And beyond that, I never say never. You know,
Right.
Marie is obviously in charge at DC now.
Right.
She and I have talked about a couple of things. When you talk about the mainstream, of course, it's really very much a question of the kind of characters I like to write, or that can be made into the kind of characters I like to write, and that's obviously the Punisher and Nick Fury, and I suppose at one stage anyway, John Constantine.
Right.
That is about as much as I can tell you on that score. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I'm also waiting to see what happens at DC and how things shake out there after all the recent upheaval.
Sure. You mentioned the Punisher, and you know, I hadn't really thought about this particular bit again until it was put in front of me. I know it's been a thing, I think, over the last year, and Rob and I enjoyed Punisher Soviet as well. It was fantastic. But Rob asks here, regretfully, the past few years have demonstrated mass ignorance of what the symbol should and should not stand for. Speaking of the Punisher, you brought the character back to relevancy, arguably. Multiple adaptations, film, all loosely based on your work. So Rob wants to know, and I think this is a good question because I know the creator of the Punisher has spoken out on this. What's worth sharing with the masses to understand why the character, and specifically the symbol, is not an accurate symbol for serve and protect?
Right. I understand what he's talking about there.
Yeah.
I know the Punisher has been mentioned.
But also, to some extent, you're not in control of what people grab. You're certainly not. It's not your creation. But, you know, the Punisher is a unique character that you have always been drawn to. So how do you reconcile your love of the Punisher with other people's love of the Punisher, I guess, is kind of what he's asking in a way.
Yeah. I mean, look, if we're going to take people to task for the misuse of fictional characters, symbols, as they look for inspiration for their real life acts, I mean, one might say we could start with God and Jesus and Allah, who I believe have racked up much bigger body counts over the years than Frank has. To be more specific, the idea of the police or police units using the Punisher symbol to express what they do, I think is silly. No policeman wants to be the Punisher because no one on earth wants to be the Punisher. No one wants to pull 3 tours of duty in a combat zone with the third one going disastrously wrong, return home, see his family slaughtered in front of him, and then devote his life to a long, cold, lonely war on crime, which is almost an abstract notion in this sense. Anyone wearing the symbol on their uniform or whatever probably just wants to wear a scary skull symbol while they terrify a few people. Then he wants to go home to the wife and kids, which isn't the Punisher, isn't Frank Castle, never will be. It's missing the point completely. Nobody wants that. And anyone who uses the symbol hasn't thought about it at all. Of course, you know, that goes back to certain other characters and symbols I mentioned earlier. People have a tendency to do that. But it's a misappropriation. It's a mistake. And it's got nothing to do with what the character's about. Again, no one wants to be the Punisher.
Right. Let's see. We were just speaking, I think, an email earlier this week about Dead Reckoning, your work with the U.S. Naval Institute,
Yeah,
their compilation of Night Witches, which I think came out, was that earlier this year or was that the tail end of last year?
I think it was last year. Yeah.
And they are working on Tankies, a collection of material that we originally published, Dynamite originally published as under the Battlefields banner, and that the Dead Reckoning is taking and putting into a collection, and that's coming soon, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think they've just put the finishing touches to that. That'll be the 3 stories from the Battlefield series, the Tankies, and the Firefly and His Majesty, and the Greenfields Beyond. And it'll be just the same format as the Night Witches book, where we take the three-part stories from Battlefields and put them all under one set of covers to make quite a choice collection.
Yeah.
I think, lovely artwork by the late Carlos Esquerra, and a nice tribute to him, I think. I mean, he did such wonderful work on that. Still miss Carlos, still miss working with him. But that was a real treat working with him on that project. It will, as I say, hopefully stand as a nice tribute to him.
Any particular, another question was, obviously, you've lost 2 high-profile, fantastic collaborators with Steve Dillon and Carlos Esquerra. Any particular remembrances that come to you on either? I know there's a lot with Steve. I think you spent more time, obviously, with Steve than you did with Carlos. But any particular remembrances that can be told to a wide audience?
Funnily enough, actually, it was last Thursday, marked 4 years since I last saw Steve. Since I said goodnight to him outside Foley's, also now gone.
Yeah.
I was thinking too, you know, as I was remembering him, I was thinking the first time I came to New York, which is very nearly the defining moment of my life, it was with Steve. It was 6 days on the beer with him. It was his idea, you know, I'm going over to New York for a long weekend. Do you want to come? Yeah, why not? And that actually changed my life. And I was thinking, yeah, he showed me this place in the beginning. It was his city first.
Yeah.
And I still remember that very, very well. As for Carlos, I didn't know him as well. Obviously, I was more than familiar with his work, having grown up on it, just like Steve. The difference was that by the time I started working in the business myself, Carlos, who was that bit older, had been living back in Spain for some time. Steve still lived in London. He moved to Dublin. Steve was only 8 or 9 years older than me, so there wasn't quite as big a gap between us as there was me and some of the 2000 AD British comics generation that I grew up on. And I think we did have that one thing in common, actually. We both started really, really early. I got my first job on my 19th birthday. Steve started at 16, working for Marvel UK. So we both sort of stuck out in that regard, and it was one of the reasons we got on so well. But I remember meeting Carlos not long after I started working the business. He was a lovely man, and it was a real treat getting to know him. But of course, with him being in Spain, it was just that bit harder to see him.
Yeah.
I do remember him sort of saying to me on a couple of occasions that the stuff that he was working on of mine was some of the most violent material he'd ever drawn, and you know, some of it on Preacher and the Tankies and so on definitely was. But I've looked at some of his older stuff from British comics, especially Judge Dredd, and perhaps the two weren't as far apart as he thought.
Yeah, you know, he might have seen the realism in your other work as being a bridge too far, as opposed to the satire or over the topness of Dredd, perhaps.
Possibly. But when you come down to individual images or sequences,
Right.
there's not a lot to choose between them.
Were you intimidated at all when you started working with either of those guys because you'd grown up with their work, or did you get over that pretty quickly? You don't strike me as a guy that's really intimidated by working with collaborators, but
I think that's a long time ago, 1990. I'd say that I began work with both of them, and yes, I'm sure I was at the time. I'm sure it was a massive deal. But as when you're working with any artist, once the pages start coming in, you get over that really, really quickly because you're more interested in what it is they're doing than any perceived status that you might have gotten hung up on. And so, no, really, there was no sort of lasting awe or anything like that. It was more a case of just getting on with it. And
yeah,
that
fell into the routine of collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, that really defined my working relationship with Steve in particular. We just got on with it. We just trusted each other.
Yeah. This is a section of social media fan questions.
Right.
So it's going to be a little bit all over the place. And I will start with, and you can yes, no, this, whatever you or pass. I'll give you three passes. Would you ever consider doing a follow-up to Caliban, a severely underrated horror comic, and would love to see more in that universe?
No, in that I think I said everything I had to say. I'm glad you liked it. I enjoyed doing that too. That book came about from many hours thinking about Alien and its many possible backstories, and discussing the same in the pub with various fellow Alien aficionados. But I think I've probably said everything I have to say with that one. I would say, though, that there is and has been a degree of interest from Hollywood on that one. So who knows where that might go.
Nice. In Fury, My War Gone By, you mentioned Nick's stint in the Korean War. Is that a time in Nick's life you're interested in exploring? I guess not necessarily just in the role of telling a Nick Fury story in Korea, but just maybe the Korean War in general.
No immediate plans. It would be interesting. It's a very interesting war to write about, to discuss. I have done so to a degree. Both the Night Witches and the Tankies ended up briefly in Korea.
Right.
It is that peculiar thematic sequel to World War II.
Right.
Almost, or perhaps it's better seen as the prequel to something else. If we're going to see these horribly costly conflicts in those terms, which I don't normally. But you do see most of the combatants largely using much of the same equipment or similar equipment to what they were just using 4 or 5 years ago. In the case of the U.S. Armed Forces, you see a lot of veterans with combat experience being drawn back into the fight. Experience they gained in World War II. It's not impossible that I might do that. I have no particular plans at the moment. Fury might be an interesting angle on
it. Whenever I read Tommy Monahan, I tend to believe he sounds like Ray Liotta. In your opinion, who does Tommy sound like?
Who does Tommy sound like?
I guess, does he sound like Ray Liotta?
He does not sound like Ray Liotta. No, I think he probably sounds a little bit more like Sean Penn in State of Grace.
Oh, okay.
But he's nowhere near as tough as that character.
Right.
Nowhere near as hard as Sean Penn. He was based visually on Gabriel Byrne in Miller's Crossing. And you might say that to an extent he's perhaps a slightly more capable, slightly more action hero version of that character, who, of course, the Gabriel Byrne character, he survives by not getting into physical trouble at all. He's more of a make things happen behind the scenes, play people off against each other kind of guy. Tommy is, of course, very, very capable with guns. Not so good when it gets to hand. But as to what he sounds like, well, if we take Gotham City as being somewhere in the Northeast, I think, somewhere north of New York, he's a working class boy from some crap neighborhood in a major city somewhere on the East Coast.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any book or movie recommendations? What have you been occupied? I know, much like everybody, you are probably all caught up on everything that at least you find entertaining in any way, shape, or form, and have bailed on the things that are not entertaining. But do you have any particular things that have stood out in your time in the last several months?
Well, I've done a hell of a lot of reading. Much of it military history. I enjoyed a couple of new novels by Joe Lansdale. One's called Jane Goes North. One's called More Better Deals. They were both very entertaining. I read a biography of Stalin, or at least a history of Stalin's time in power, called The Court of the Red Tsar, which I strongly recommend. It's a very interesting true life horror story.
Yeah.
I've been reading various things that would be almost too obscure to mention.
Right.
But in terms of TV, just recently, I thoroughly enjoyed the second season of Criminal UK.
Mm-hmm.
That was superb. And the first episode of Des, starring David Tennant as the serial killer Dennis Nielsen.
Oh, okay.
Which is highly recommended. And a few movies here and there, like I thought The Outpost was very good.
Yeah.
That Afghanistan war movie. I liked Sea Fever. I liked Blow the Man Down, which was a good little crime film with two sisters getting in over their heads. Probably a few other things, but nothing that's really leaping out at me at the minute. I'm about to start Wolf Hall, which is on my list for a long time.
Yeah, it's on my list too. You gotta ramp up. I forget how many seasons. For me anyway, to get into a period piece, I gotta ramp up and just stick it. Otherwise, my attention span will blow right out. Yeah. Let's see. This is this is probably one that gets asked all the time, but I should probably ask it just because people watching these kind of things like to know this. But what advice would you offer to a budding writer?
Well, in terms of the actual craft, I would say what everyone says really, which is keep writing, write and write and write. Just like an artist has to draw and draw and draw, so a writer has to. I would say think hard about the way people speak. That's a particular bugbear of mine, and it's why I can't really read 90% of comic books, because I don't find the dialogue remotely convincing. Listen to the way people speak. If you want to have your characters transmit information, do so and then say it aloud and see if you can make it sound remotely plausible. Even the rhythm of it, if it's something that someone could say fast enough in the situation they're in.
Yeah.
Beyond that, as far as getting published goes, I would say that if you forget just for a second about our current circumstances with this bloody pandemic, things should be easier for you than they have been for anyone trying to get into the business before.
Agreed.
With the coming of the internet, with the immediacy of email, with the ability a budding writer has to perhaps contact an artist and get their stuff drawn, even if the art is as perhaps as ropey as the writing might be at the beginning. Right. It's still a much easier way to communicate the idea, gets it under the editor's nose. compare that with 30 years ago when I knew two DC editors who hated the submissions pile so much, and the writing submissions pile, because you know what that's like. You can tell whether or not art's any good instantly.
Yep.
Writing, you have to wade through the text. But these two hated doing it so much that one night a month they would sit down with a bottle of whiskey and pour over this, knowing that the law of averages said that they were going to have to work through an awful lot of material to possibly find one good guy. Well, That's a thing of the past. It should be a lot easier now. And beyond that, I would say that once you're in, just behave as decently and honestly as professionally as you possibly can. Do your work on time. Don't mess people about. And try to keep a grip on your sense of where you stand. You'll find out pretty quickly whether or not you can sustain a creator-owned book, and if people are interested in you just because it's you, or because you're the 295th guy to write the Hulk,
right?
The 330th to write X-Men,
right?
Be as realistic about that as you possibly can. There is probably a great deal more advice that I could give about establishing oneself by social media, where I own social media, but I am not, so I can't.
Right.
That's where my expertise runs out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're in a special place in that sense, is that you don't need to be. But if you were just starting now, you would need to be. Although that's arguable, I think. But just like anything, it's a tool, and you can use it terribly, or you can use it less terribly. I think that those are the only two options with social media these days. It's not you can use it well. It's just how less terrible can it be. But
I think you're right. I think it's very much a case of if you are using it, trying to keep a grip and being realistic about what your status, your perceived status on social media translates to in terms of actual sales of comics in the real world. You and I both know people who have ended up mystified when something they've been working on has been cancelled, when they can point to all these likes they've gotten on social media, and that proves the true worth of likes. Social media in that instance. It's the people who can see past that will be able to use social media properly.
Yeah. And, I would just also add, get out in the real world. I think that goes to a lot of what you were saying, obviously pandemic issues aside, but that was what you're saying about being able to write dialogue is, don't spend all your time in your room, get out.
Listen to people.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. I know the answer to that one. You have an artist in mind when starting a project, and does that affect choices in the story? I think in general, you come to projects. You're not at a place in your career where somebody just hands you an artist off the street. You're a full package at this point. So
that's largely true, and I'll tend to fit the artist to the story rather than having to make changes to the script to suit the artist.
Right.
One exception, I suppose, was Steve Epting on my graphic novel Sarah, which is about a Russian woman sniper in World War II. TKO, the publisher, set me up with Steve, and I'd heard of him and I knew his work, but I'd never worked with him before. And that proved to be very nearly a marriage made in heaven. It's one of the best art jobs that I've ever had done in one of my stories. And that book turned out to be, creatively for me anyway, something of a triumph. I couldn't have been happier. But most of the time, in every other instance I can think of in the past 10 years, almost, I've known who was going to draw the book before I began the scripts, or I've made sure to have control over that aspect of the book.
Did you bring, and I might know this, but I can't recall, did you bring Jason Burrows to the projects that you worked with him at Marvel, or was he already at Marvel and you just had the chance to work with him since he was already there?
I think in that, well, the only one we've done together at Marvel is The Punisher.
Right.
And I think because of our past on the Avatar books, like
Right.
3 and Wormwood and Crossed, we were a natural fit, particularly with the subject matter of that Punisher story that harkens back to 303, which is another book about the fighting in Afghanistan that we did at Avatar.
And I don't know. I don't know if you can speak for Jason, but this question I thought was interesting as well, because maybe I'm just going through life with blinders because I didn't see this either. But Jason, let's see. Jason Burrows also seems to carry a lot of similar stylistic notes as your longtime partner Steve Dillon. Which when I see those two names together, I go, well, duh, yeah. I mean, there is a tremendous there. Especially as his career has continued. How do you think he follows in that legacy, and has he discussed that influence with you?
It's a long time since I've actually seen Jason, because I think he moved to the Northwest in recent years. But
he fled downstate Illinois. He fled.
I think so. So it's some time since I've seen him, but I'm sure we did talk about it. I completely agree, by the way. I mean, I see a lot of Steve Dillon in his work. I think of Jason's work as being a sort of a mesh between Steve and maybe someone like Frank Quitely.
Oh yeah, with the real fine attention to detail and
But that wonderfully flowing storytelling where you're in doubt about what's going on at any particular time.
And real people. I think that was one of the things that was great about Steve, is that people look like people, and I think the same thing with Jason is they look like people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They trudge along, kind of down at heel, the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Yeah. You mentioned Sarah. Are there plans to do a question here about that? Are there plans to do more with? In that same vein.
In that same vein, yeah. I will be doing more stories about what would we say, woman warriors on the Russian front. It's a subject that always fascinated me. But anyone who's read Sarah can tell you it has quite a final ending. So it wouldn't be a direct follow-up, but it's very much the same world, the same themes.
And I think we're getting close to the end here. I'm going to end with this one, because I think this is a good one. What do you feel are one or two of your most overlooked stories from audiences? I mean, what are the I wouldn't say underappreciated, but what are the things that flew under a lot of people's radar?
I rarely have a particularly strong sense of that, but I would say I can tell you some of my favorites that don't seem to come up much.
Sure.
A Train Called Love.
Right.
You guys published. I thought was a lot of fun. Red Team, again, another dynamite book. That chap who mentioned Caliban earlier. I was going to say Rover Red Charlie, which was another Avatar book, the one about the three dogs after the apocalypse. But it did seem to garner a certain degree of attention. I do sign a lot of copies of that. And beyond that, I suppose you'd be talking about a fair few of the war stories. There was an old Authority spin-off I did called Kev, which the lead character of which I'm terribly fond of to this day. It's a hard one to answer because I'll probably end up just talking about my favorites rather than ones that may be not as well known as others. Again, I don't have a great sense of it. I took a real pleasure a few years ago in reviving the old British character Johnny Red, who for a big part of my childhood was my favorite comic book character. I think, everyone in comics does that. Everyone who gets into comics does that. When they're doing work for hire, they bring back an old character, or they just work on major characters that they read when they were kids. It's just that in my case, of course, in the US comic industry being what it is, the ones I tend to go for are very obscure.
Right.
Johnny Red was one of those, and it was a real treat to work with Keith Burns on the book.
Is there anything that we did not cover that you have coming up? I know obviously we're in the middle of Dear Becky, wrapping up 7 and 8, collected edition in early part of 2021. But anything else on the near horizon that you want to throw out there?
What else? There are a few things. There's a time travel comedy from AWA, which Goran Sudzuka is working on, doing a lovely job. There's the Punisher book I mentioned. There will be more war comics, mostly OGNs. Actually, that was a format I took to very strongly on the String Bags, which Dead Reckoning published earlier this year. And beyond that, there's the stuff that should be coming to mind but isn't.
Right.
So there you go.
It's been that kind of year.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know how to wrap this, so I'll just say thanks. Thanks to everyone that watched, that stuck with it.
All right.
Everyone stay safe, and see you soon. And
All right. Cheers. Thanks for watching. And thank you, Joe.
Yeah, of course.
Cheers.